I did not plan to disappear from the marked path. That is the story people tell afterward, when fear needs to be shaped into a mistake. The truth is less dramatic and far more unsettling. I believed I was being efficient. The trek was supposed to be routine, 3 days, a documented route, enough foot traffic to feel safe, but not enough to feel crowded. Pine and fir rose on both sides of the trail, their needles carpeting the ground and swallowing the sound of my boots. The air smelled clean in a sharp, almost medicinal way. Sap, wet bark, old leaves breaking down into soil. Above the tree line, clouds hung low and heavy, smearing the sunlight into a flat, colorless glow. I checked my watch. 2:40 p.m. Too early to stop. Too late to improvise recklessly. Or so I thought. The map showed a secondary path branching east. A service trail, barely mentioned, looping back toward the main route a few kilometers ahead. Shorter, quieter. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at the faint break in the undergrowth. The red paint marks on the stones were still visible, but faded, uneven, as if whoever had marked them had lost patience halfway through. I told myself it meant the trail was old, not abandoned. The moment I stepped off the main path, the forest changed. It wasn't silence, it was removal. Wind was the first thing to go. Then insects, the background noise I hadn't noticed until it vanished. The space around me felt padded, like a room designed to absorb sound. Even my breathing felt intrusive, too loud, as though I were violating some unspoken rule. I paused without knowing why. Nothing moved, nothing reacted, and that, more than anything, unsettled me. I continued walking. The ground grew darker underfoot. The soil here was compacted, smooth in a way untouched forest floor never is. No pine cones, no snapped twigs, no roots breaking the surface. It felt worked, pressed down by repeated passage. When my boots sank into it, the impression faded almost immediately, the earth slowly lifting back into place. That was when I noticed the stones. They weren't scattered, they were placed. Every few meters, a stone sat at the edge of the path, flat side up, edges worn smooth. Some were partially buried, others rested carefully on the surface, as if arranged and then forgotten. At first I thought they were trail markers, until I realized they didn't point forward. They pointed inward. The path itself began to curve, subtly, not sharply enough to register as a turn. More like a suggestion, like something guiding rather than directing. I should have turned back then. I know that now. At the time, I felt only mild unease, the kind you dismiss with logic. You're tired. You're overthinking. I reached for my phone. No signal. The battery indicator flickered between 12% and nothing, as if the device itself couldn't decide whether it was still functional. I locked the screen and slid it back into my pocket, suddenly aware of how quiet everything felt without even the soft buzz of electronics nearby. That was when I heard the bells. At first they sounded distant, faint metallic taps drifting through the trees. I thought of wind chimes hanging outside a cabin, disturbed by a breeze I couldn't feel. But the sound wasn't free or bright. It was muted, restrained, as if the bells were wrapped in cloth or tied too closely together to ring properly. The sound rose and fell, not rhythmically, organically, like breathing. My body reacted before my mind caught up. I lowered myself behind a fallen log coated in thick green moss. The wood was damp, spongy under my fingers. Ants crawled across my wrists, their legs cold and deliberate, but I didn't brush them away. I didn't want to move. The bells grew louder, closer, and beneath them, something else. Footsteps, many of them, measured, unhurried. The ground ahead sloped downward, and through the trees I could see the forest thinning, opening into a shallow basin, carved unnaturally smooth. I stayed where I was, barely daring to breathe, as shadows moved at the edge of my vision. Whatever was coming wasn't lost. It knew exactly where it was going. From where I lay, the basin looked like a wound in the forest. The trees did not thin naturally, they stopped. Their roots clung to the edge of the slope as if reluctant to cross some invisible boundary. Moss grew thick along the rim, darker than anywhere else, damp in a way that suggested shade even when the clouds thinned briefly overhead. People emerged from the trees one by one. There were 13 of them. I counted because counting gives the mind something to hold on to when fear starts to loosen everything else. 13 figures, each wrapped in layered clothing the color of earth and bark. Browns, grays, dull greens, nothing that reflected light. Their faces were hidden beneath hoods sewn from coarse fabric, the kind that absorbed detail rather than revealed it. They did not speak, not to greet one another, not to signal readiness. They moved with quiet assurance, spacing themselves evenly around the basin, as if following measurements only they could see. Every footstep was deliberate, every pause timed. I realized with a slow tightening in my chest that this was not a meeting. It was a procedure. At the center of the basin stood something covered in canvas. It was tall, taller than any of the figures around it. The fabric was stretched tight in places and slack in others, pulled over a shape that refused to be fully hidden. Ropes bound it to iron stakes driven deep into the earth. From those ropes hung the bells I had heard, dozens of them, each wrapped partially in cloth, their sound deliberately muffled. The bells rang softly as the canvas shifted, not because of wind, because something beneath it adjusted its weight. A line had been cut into the ground around the central structure, then another, and another. They intersected, forming a network of channels carved into the clay. The grooves were old, worn smooth, darkened by repeated use. Ash filled the deeper cuts, something darker stained the intersections. One of the figures stepped forward. The hood slipped just enough for me to see a jawline, narrow, pale. A woman, I thought, though I couldn't say why. She carried a bowl carved from a single piece of wood, so aged it had turned almost black. The rim was nicked and smoothed by hands that had used it often. She knelt. Still, no one spoke. She tipped the bowl. Liquid poured into the channels, thick at first, then thinning as it spread, guided by the carved lines. Blood, diluted with water, but unmistakable. It moved with purpose, flowing toward the center, pooling at precise junctions, as if the ground itself knew where it was meant to go. The air changed, not in temperature, but in pressure. My ears popped softly. Breathing felt heavier, like inhaling just before a storm breaks. The forest sounds, the insects, the distant birds, did not return. It was as if the basin existed inside a pocket cut away from the rest of the world. The canvas tightened. Seams I hadn't noticed before became visible, pulling against thread that was never meant to hold under tension. The bells stilled, silenced not by touch, but by proximity. The sound simply died, swallowed. Every figure in the ring knelt, foreheads pressed to the ground. The canvas separated, not torn, not ripped. It parted along a seam stitched deliberately down its length, the thread unraveling itself as if released from obligation. The fabric fell away in slow, careful folds. What stood beneath it did not resemble anything I had a name for. It had mass, weight. It pressed into the earth, compacting the soil beneath it. Where it bent, the air bent too, warping slightly like heat rising off asphalt. Its surface reflected no light, not even the dull gray of the sky. Looking at it felt like staring at a space where something should be and wasn't. It did not roar. It did not scream. It did not speak. It simply existed. One of its limbs, or something that functioned as one, extended toward the channels. Where it made contact, the blood did not spill or splash. It vanished, evaporated into a fine red mist that rose slowly, deliberately, and was inhaled by the kneeling figures. No one flinched. No one hesitated. I understood then, with sickening clarity, that the ritual was not meant to bring the thing into the world. It was meant to make the world able to hold it. My foot slipped on the damp moss. The sound was small, insignificant. A single careless scrape. 13 heads lifted at once. For a single suspended moment, nothing happened. 13 hooded figures froze, their movements arrested so completely it was as if time itself had hesitated. The thing at the center did not turn. It did not need to. Awareness seemed to ripple outward from it, pressing against the basin walls, against the trees, against me. The pressure in the air deepened. It became harder to breathe, not because of a lack of oxygen, but because each breath felt observed, measured, as though the act of inhaling was now part of a system I did not understand. No one spoke. That, more than anything, confirmed my terror. There were no shouted alarms, no whispered commands. Whatever sound I had made had not alerted them. It had been registered. The woman who had poured the blood rose first. She did not look toward me. Instead, she adjusted the bowl, tipping it slightly so the remaining liquid drained into a secondary channel I hadn't noticed before. A contingency built into the design. Two others moved in perfect synchrony to the iron stakes, tightening ropes with slow, practiced turns. The bells remained silent, their cloth wrappings dampened further, as if sound itself was now undesirable. This was not panic. This was correction. The thing in the center shifted. The movement was minimal, but its consequences were not. The soil beneath it compacted further, cracking in a circular pattern that followed the basin's geometry. Fine dust rose and hovered rather than falling, suspended unnaturally, as though gravity had briefly loosened its hold. I felt a sudden, overwhelming certainty that the ritual had reached a point where interruption was impossible. Not because of magic, because of investment. Too much had already been committed. Blood, time, preparation. The system would complete itself, with or without full participation. The limb extended again. This time it did not touch the channels. It touched the air above them. The red mist thickened, coiling upward, then collapsing inward, drawn toward the thing's surface and absorbed without residue. As it did, the figures in the ring began to tremble. Not violently, subtly, like machinery vibrating under load. One of them, standing directly opposite me, tilted their head, not toward the sound, toward the absence of it, toward the space where something did not belong, where I was. A sharp pressure stabbed behind my eyes. Images flooded my mind uninvited. The basin viewed from above, the stone markers leading inward, the service trail branching off from the main path. Knowledge I had not earned, laid out with mechanical clarity. It was not reading my thoughts. It was locating a variable. I shifted my weight. The moss gave way again, a soft, wet sound far louder than it had any right to be. That broke the stillness. The figures did not turn toward me. They stood, all at once. The thing at the center rose higher, unfolding more of itself, its outline distorting as if struggling to conform to the space allotted to it. The ropes strained but did not snap. They were not restraints. They were anchors. I understood then what the bells were for. Not to summon, to measure movement. The bells began to ring, not loudly but precisely, responding to the thing's adjustment, mapping its presence in sound the way instruments map seismic activity. I did not wait to see more. I ran. Branches tore at my face as I crashed through the undergrowth, no longer caring about silence or caution. Behind me, there were no shouts, no cries, no pounding pursuit. Only the bells, ringing faster now, adapting. And beneath them, something else, something moving without sound, without haste, certain that distance was irrelevant. The forest twisted, paths folded in on themselves. Slopes steepened where they should not. Trees stood too close together, then too far apart, as if the terrain were being subtly reconfigured to delay me without fully stopping me. This was not a chase meant to end quickly. It was a test, and I was failing it. I did not look back. I did not need to. The air around me warped with every step, bending inward, urging me toward the basin even as my legs carried me away. Whatever had been summoned did not need to pursue aggressively. It had already entered the system. And systems prefer balance. I don't know how long I ran. Time stopped behaving normally the moment I left the basin. My lungs burned, my legs shook, but exhaustion felt distant, irrelevant, as though my body had been demoted to a secondary concern. The forest no longer looked like a place. It looked like a mechanism. Branches snapped shut behind me. Roots rose where the ground should have been smooth. Slopes angled just enough to force my pace slower without fully stopping me. I understood then that the terrain wasn't blocking me. It was correcting my trajectory. I burst into a clearing and nearly collapsed in relief. Then I saw the trees. Their trunks were carved with symbols. Not graffiti, not random markings. The cuts were deep, old, and reopened again and again. The grooves darkened by weather and time. The same shapes repeated across bark and stone alike, etched at eye level, at shoulder height, at heights no human arm could comfortably reach. This place had been used. Not one. Regularly. The air here felt wrong, thicker, pressed inward. My ears rang softly, a low, continuous tone that had no source. I realized with a cold drop in my stomach that the clearing wasn't a refuge. It was another node. Something moved to my left. Tall, too smooth in its motion. I caught only fragments through the trees. A distortion. A bending of space. Like looking at something through water that wasn't there. It did not break branches. It did not displace leaves. The forest accommodated it. I turned and ran downhill. I slipped, fell, rolled. The ground tore skin from my palms, my knees. Pain flared and vanished, overridden by urgency. I slid through ferns and wet leaves until the sound hit me first. Water. Fast. Cold. Close. The stream cut across my path abruptly, narrow but violent, swollen by recent rain. Without thinking, I threw myself into it. The shock was immediate and brutal, stealing my breath, locking my muscles as icy water forced its way into my boots and clothes. I went under. For a moment, there was nothing but roar and cold and darkness. Then, release. The pressure vanished. It was so sudden I almost gasped underwater. The weight in the air lifted. The ringing in my ears stopped. When I surfaced, choking and shaking, the forest sounded like a forest again. Birds, wind, the chaotic, comforting noise of a world behaving as expected. I dragged myself onto the opposite bank, soaked, bleeding, trembling so violently I could barely push myself upright. I waited. Nothing crossed the water. The distortion I had sensed at my back stopped at the edge of the stream, as if it had reached the limit of an instruction it could not override. The surface of the water rippled normally, reflecting gray sky and trees. No bending, no warping. Running water mattered. Not symbolically, functionally. I stayed there for a long time, long enough for my hands to go numb and my teeth to stop chattering. When I finally moved, it was slow, deliberate. I did not climb back toward the path I had taken. I followed the stream downhill, keeping water between myself and whatever system I had escaped. By dusk, I reached a road. The world resumed its indifference. A car stopped. A driver asked questions. An ambulance arrived. I answered mechanically, offering pieces of truth arranged carefully to resemble a lie. I never mentioned the basin. Never mentioned the bells. But as the vehicle pulled away, I looked back once. And on the far bank of the stream, just beyond where the forest resumed its unnatural order, I saw the stones. Flat side up, waiting. They kept me overnight. A mild concussion, dehydration, exposure. The words were neat, clinical, reassuring in the way explanations always are when they reduce something vast into something manageable. I nodded when required. Signed forms. Drank water that tasted faintly of plastic. No one asked why my answers avoided detail, and I was careful not to volunteer any. People want coherence. I gave them just enough. The police came in the morning, 2 of them. Polite, curious in a procedural way. Where had I left the trail? Did I see anyone else? Was I aware of private land nearby? I told them about the faded markers, about thinking the service trail was maintained. I did not tell them about the way the ground resisted being marked, or how sound had behaved differently there. They took notes. They always do. One of them mentioned casually that 2 hikers had been reported missing further north. Separate incidents, months apart, no pattern. He said this like it was meant to reassure me. I went home 2 days later. For a while, nothing happened. That was almost worse. I slept badly, waking with the sensation of pressure in my ears, as if altitude had changed while I wasn't paying attention. I stopped hiking, sold most of my gear, gave the rest away. I avoided forests, parks, even tree-lined streets when I could. It felt foolish, but fear doesn't negotiate with reason. Then the small things started. A stone outside my apartment door. Flat side up. I told myself it was coincidence. People track dirt inside all the time. Still, I kicked it away before unlocking the door. That night, I dreamed of bells wrapped in cloth, ringing without sound. A week later, my phone battery drained from full to empty in minutes while I was walking home. No apps running, no explanation. When it died, the air felt heavier. When I plugged it in at home, the feeling lifted. Patterns began to form. They were careful. I realized that with a clarity that made my hands shake. Whatever I had interrupted in the basin had not failed. It had adjusted. The system had absorbed the loss of 13 participants and 1 escaping variable and continued operating at a lower intensity. Accounting takes time. I started researching missing persons, hiking forums, archived reports. It wasn't hard to find stories that didn't make sense on their own. People vanishing near old service trails, near forests with unusual clearings, near streams that locals avoided without quite knowing why. No one ever mentioned a cult. No one ever mentioned a thing that did not speak. Because the ones who saw enough did not return. And the ones who returned learned quickly that speaking invited attention. The bells came back. Not in the world. In my head. A sensation more than a sound, like pressure changes just before weather shifts. I learned to recognize it. Learned what made it stronger. Standing still too long, being indoors without running water nearby, sleeping too deeply. I moved apartments, then cities. The patterns followed, diluted but persistent. Stones appeared where they shouldn't. Maps glitched. Trails looped incorrectly. Places that should have felt neutral felt prepared. I understood then that this was not pursuit. It was inventory. They were not hunting me. They were making sure I was still being counted. I am writing this because silence favors them. Not because they demand it, not because they threaten it. Silence favors them because their work does not require explanation. It requires only repetition and patience, and those are easier to maintain when no one compares notes. I have learned the rules. Not all of them. Just enough to survive longer than I was meant to. Running water disrupts their measurements. It does not stop them, but it introduces error. And systems like theirs avoid error when possible. This is why the old settlements were built near rivers, why certain bridges were never finished, why some places feel wrong only when the water dries up. Marked paths matter. Not because they are safe, but because they are accounted for. The danger lies in efficiency, in shortcuts, in quiet detours, in routes that promise solitude. Places maintained just enough to feel usable, but not enough to be supervised. The thing they summon does not speak. I need to be very clear about that. It does not bargain. It does not deceive. It does not issue commands or make demands. It operates the way gravity operates, the way pressure equalizes, the way structures fail when weight exceeds tolerance. The ritual is not worship. It is calibration. They are not bringing something into the world. They are adjusting the world to make room for something that is already pressing against it. I think this is why they noticed me so quickly. I was not part of the design. I introduced noise into a system that values precision. My escape was not an affront. It was an imbalance. I have moved again. I live near water now. I keep taps running at night. I avoid forests, construction sites, unfinished developments, anywhere geometry looks deliberate but unattended. Still, the bells return sometimes, faint, careful, as if wrapped in cloth. When they do, I check my surroundings. Look for stones placed too neatly. Listen for the absence of sound rather than its presence. I do not panic. Panic wastes energy, and energy draws attention. If you are reading this, understand what I am risking by writing it down. Records persist. Systems adapt. But so do people. If you hike, stay on marked trails. If you see a path that looks maintained but unloved, turn back. If the forest goes quiet all at once, leave. If you hear bells that do not quite ring, do not look for their source. And if you ever find a place where the ground seems shaped rather than grown, where the air feels heavier without reason, where sound behaves incorrectly, do not assume you are alone. I wasn't. And somewhere, even now, someone is accounting for the imbalance I left behind. If they finish correcting it, the next person who wanders off the trail